Two bobcats wait at his porch for days. Rescue reveals a truth no one expected. The rope tugs sharply at Elias's left wrist, yanking him from the depths of sleep into the cold reality of the October night. His eyes snapped open, pupils adjusting to the darkness of his cabin, the silent bird's nest, as he had named this wooden sanctuary decades ago, lived up to its title. No bells ever rang here. No knocks ever sounded at his door. At 75 years old, the former ranger had long surrendered his hearing to the violence of his past, to the dynamite that had torn through mountain passes and the chainsaws that had screamed through ancient timber. His world now consisted entirely of vibration, of feeling rather than hearing. The strand of hemp rope wound around his bony wrist served as his only alarm system, connected directly to the copper pipe wind chime hanging on his porch. When something disturbed those pipes, the rope would pull, and Elias would know. He turned his head slowly to the right. Echo, his one-eyed cream beige American shorthair, sat perfectly upright on the edge of the quilt, his single amber eye gleaming in what little moonlight filtered through the window. The cat had clearly been awake for some time, his attention fixed with laser precision on the heavy oak door. His tail stood straight up like a flagpole, but the fur remained smooth, not puffed. Echo was not alarmed. He was waiting. Elias pushed himself up from the narrow bed, his joints protesting with the stiffness that came from 7.5 decades of hard living. He reached for the hurricane lantern on the bedside table, turning up the wick until warm yellow light pushed back the shadows. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he shuffled toward the door. Though he could not hear the sound, he could only feel the give of the old wood, the slight vibration traveling up through his legs. His weathered hand reached for the iron latch. He lifted it slowly, deliberately, then pulled the door inward. The October full moon hung heavy and bright in the sky, flooding his porch with cold silver light that seemed almost liquid in its intensity. And there, positioned with absolute stillness, sat two wild bobcats. The larger one he recognized immediately, Sierra. He had given her that name 5 years ago. Though she had never heard him speak it, her coat was thick and dense, marked with the kind of tawny brown and cream coloring that made bobcats nearly invisible in dappled forest light. Her amber eyes stared at him without blinking, without aggression, without fear. Beside her sat a younger cat, smaller but nearly identical in posture and coloring. This had to be her daughter, Willow. Elias decided in that moment, naming her after the graceful way she held her head. They made no sound. They did not yowl or hiss. They simply sat, as motionless as two sculptures carved from the very stone of the mountains themselves. Their stillness was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to dwarf even the chill that rose from the mist gathering in the hollow below his cabin. Elias studied them for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. Hungry, he thought. They must be hungry. October had been brutal this year, with an early frost killing off much of the usual prey. Small mammals had gone to ground early. The deer had migrated down from the high country ahead of schedule. Even the most skilled predators would be feeling the pinch. He turned back into his cabin, moving to the corner where he kept his stores. A large ceramic jar sat on a low shelf, sealed with a wooden lid. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were strips of dried venison, dark red and heavily salted. This was his winter reserve, the meat he had worked all summer to prepare. Each strip represented hours of labor, of hunting and butchering and careful preservation. But he did not hesitate. He pulled out one of the larger pieces and carried it back to the door. The cold air hit him again as he stepped onto the porch. He placed the venison in the corner, near the railing, then stepped back to give them space. Sierra's head lowered. She sniffed at the meat, her nose twitching slightly. Then she raised her head and looked directly into Elias's eyes. She did not move toward the food. Willow mimicked her mother exactly, lowering her head to sniff, then looking up at the old man without touching the offering. A chill ran through Elias that had nothing to do with the temperature. A bobcat refusing fresh meat in October, on the edge of winter, was wrong. It violated everything he knew about animal behavior. He stood there for a moment longer, watching them watch him, then slowly backed into his cabin and closed the door. He latched it and returned to his bed, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sierra's gaze, those amber eyes boring into his own with an intensity that felt almost human. They were asking for something. But what the next night, the rope tugged at his wrist again. Same time, same sharp pull. He rose, lit the lantern, opened the door. Sierra and Willow sat in precisely the same positions, as though they had never left. The piece of venison remained in the corner, untouched. Elias stared at it, then at the cats. The meat had begun to frost over, crystals forming along its edges. He closed the door again without offering more food. There was no point. The third night repeated with mechanical precision. The rope pulled, the door opened, the cat sat, the venison, now completely covered in white frost, remained where he had placed it. Elias felt a strange unease beginning to coil in his gut. This was not natural behavior. This was not how wild animals acted. The irrational persistence of it began to wear on him, creating a low-level anxiety that hummed beneath his thoughts throughout the day. On the fourth night, everything changed. The rope tugged. Elias rose, lit the lantern, moved to the door. But as he cracked it open, Echo suddenly bolted. The old cat, who normally moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, shot through the narrow gap between Elias's legs and out onto the porch. He showed absolutely no fear as he approached the two wild bobcats, each of whom could have killed him with a single swipe of their claws. Echo walked directly up to Sierra and sat down beside her, his tail curling around his feet. Then he turned his head and looked back at Elias. The cat took several steps toward the dark forest. He stopped. He looked back again. His single eye gleamed in the lantern light. Understanding hit Elias like a physical blow. They wanted him to follow. They needed him to come with them. Something was wrong. Something urgent enough to bring wild animals to his door night after night, to make them refuse food, to drive them to seek help from a human. He did not stop to question his interpretation. He moved with surprising speed for a man his age, grabbing his tattered red and black flannel shirt from the hook by the door and shrugging it on over his thermal undershirt. He snatched up the hurricane lantern and his old herbal first aid kit, a wooden box he had not opened in months. As he turned to step through the door, the hemp rope still loosely tied around his wrist caught on the doorknob. The fibers, weakened by age and constant use, snapped cleanly in two. Elias froze. He stared down at the broken piece of rope dangling from his wrist. For 5 years, that rope had been his lifeline, his connection to the world, his only way of knowing when something required his attention. He unwound it slowly from his wrist, coiled it carefully, and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. Tonight, he thought, my life no longer depends on that safe wind chime. Tonight, I trust something else entirely. He stepped off the porch and into the darkness. Echo immediately took the lead, his pale cream tail visible even in the dim light. Sierra and Willow fell into position on either side of Elias, moving with him like escorts, like guards. Whenever he came close to tripping over a root or stepping into a depression, one of them would brush lightly against his leg, warning him, guiding him. Though he could not hear the rustling of leaves or the snap of twigs, Elias moved with the trained silence of his ranger's days, feeling the give of soil beneath his boots, choosing his steps with care. The forest closed around them. The canopy overhead blocked most of the moonlight, leaving only scattered patches of silver to mark their path. Echo navigated by sound and scent, stopping occasionally to make sure Elias was still following. The bobcats moved like liquid shadows, their paws making no sound that Elias could have heard even if his ears had worked. The only sounds in his world were the ones he created, the soft thud of his boots, the whisper of his breath. They walked for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 40 minutes, 2 miles deep into Blackwood Ridge, far from any trail Elias knew. The trees here were old growth, massive oaks and maples that had stood for centuries. Finally, Echo stopped at the base of one particularly ancient oak. Its trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, its roots spreading out like the tentacles of some enormous creature. Between two of these roots was a gap, a natural hollow formed by time and erosion. The smell hit Elias before the lantern light reached the hollow. Blood, fresh blood, with that distinctive metallic tang. But beneath it, another smell, older and more ominous, the smell of rust and old iron. He raised the lantern higher, angling it to illuminate the space between the roots. A young male bobcat lay there, pressed back against the rock face at the rear of the hollow. His breathing was rapid and shallow, visible in the way his rib cage expanded and contracted. His eyes were squeezed shut, and his left hind leg was clamped in the jaws of a serrated iron trap, the kind that had been illegal for decades but still turned up in these mountains, set by men who did not care about laws. Elias recognized the cat immediately. Jasper, Sierra's son. He had seen this young male from a distance several times over the past year. Always in Sierra's company, always learning. The trap had caught him just above the ankle, its rusted teeth buried deep in fur and flesh. Blood had pooled beneath the leg, dark and thick. There was no possibility of carrying him back immediately. The cat was too injured, too frightened. Any attempt to move him now would cause more damage. Elias knelt beside the hollow, setting the lantern down carefully. His hands, which trembled constantly these days from age and old injuries, suddenly became steady. He had done this before. Many times, back when he still wore the ranger uniform. Back when his job had been to protect these mountains from men who saw them only as resources to exploit. He opened his first aid kit and pulled out a small wooden wedge, carved from oak and hardened in fire. He examined the trap carefully. It was old, probably 40 or 50 years old, its spring mechanism crusted with rust but still functional. He could see the maker's mark stamped into the iron. Clayton Vance, he knew that name. Everyone in this county knew that name. Elias inserted the wedge into the spring mechanism, working it in slowly, feeling for the catch point. He used a piece of branch as a lever, applying pressure gradually. The philosophy of leverage was simple, something he had learned from his father. The older the wood, the better it burns, the harder the lesson, the deeper it stays. He felt the mechanism give, felt the tension release. A vibration traveled up through his hands as the jaws snapped open. At that exact moment, Jasper screamed. Elias saw the cat's mouth open impossibly wide, saw his entire body convulse with pain, but heard absolutely nothing. The silence was absolute and terrible. He threw the lever aside and moved quickly, wrapping his arms around Jasper's upper body, pulling the cat's head against his chest. He pressed his aged, thin chest tightly against the young animal's frantically beating heart. He closed his eyes and felt the vibration of the scream traveling through Jasper's body and into his own, felt the wild, panicked rhythm of the cat's heartbeat, and he matched it with his own breathing, slow and steady, letting his calmness transmit through physical contact. I hear you, he thought. I hear you. Gradually. So gradually it seemed to take forever. The violent vibrations began to subside. Jasper's breathing slowed. The convulsions stopped. The vibration changed quality, shifting from the harsh frequency of pain to something softer, almost a purr. When Elias finally opened his eyes and loosened his grip, the young bobcat was looking at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Fear, yes, but also trust. Echo approached then, moving slowly. The old cream-colored cat walked right up to Jasper's face and began to lick him gently, grooming him the way a mother would groom a kitten. The sight of it, this one-eyed house cat comforting a wild predator 3 times his size, made something break loose in Elias's chest. He blinked hard, forcing back tears he could not afford to shed. Not now, there was work to do. He pulled out a small jar from his kit. The salve inside was jet black, a mixture of pine resin, beeswax, and dried herbs from the garden his late wife Martha had tended for 40 years. Comfrey, yarrow, calendula, plants with names he still whispered sometimes when he was alone. He unscrewed the lid and scooped out a generous amount, applying it carefully to the wounds on Jasper's leg. The flesh was torn, but not as badly as he had feared. The trap had caught mostly fur and skin. Another inch higher and it would have shattered bone. He tore a long strip from the bottom of his flannel shirt, winding it around the leg to hold the salve in place and provide compression. Jasper did not struggle. He lay still, watching Elias work with those golden eyes. When it was done, Elias sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The lantern light shifted as he moved, and suddenly illuminated Sierra's left shoulder. An old scar caught the light, pale against her tawny fur. The shape was distinctive. It was an X formed by two intersecting lines. Memory crashed over Elias like a wave. 5 years ago, early spring, a young bobcat tangled in discarded fishing net, thrashing and panicking. He had found her purely by accident, had spent an hour cutting her free. She had scratched his arm badly in her terror. 4 parallel lines that had taken weeks to heal. He had never seen her again after that day, until now. He looked down at his own left forearm. 4 faint white scars ran from his wrist toward his elbow. He looked back at Sierra's shoulder, at the X-shaped mark where the net had cut deepest before he freed her. Their eyes met. Sierra blinked slowly, deliberately, holding the blink for a long moment before opening her eyes again. It was a gesture of trust, of peace, something cats did only with those they considered safe. Elias smiled and raised his right hand, extending his thumb upward. She tilted her head slightly, watching the gesture, then blinked slowly again. The ancient forest was always fair, Elias thought, always balanced. He had saved her life once, not expecting anything in return. And now she had led him to her son, trusting him to save another life. The debt had been remembered and repaid. But it was more than that. This was not about debt. This was about something deeper, about the bonds that could form between species when fear was set aside, when respect was given freely. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jasper was stable enough to move. Elias fashioned a rough travois from branches in his jacket, and with Sierra and Willow's help, managed to drag the young cat back to his cabin. He set up a recovery area in his small shed, lined with old blankets and straw. Jasper would heal there, under Elias's care, for as long as it took. But first, there was another matter to attend to. Elias picked up the iron trap, carrying it awkwardly in both hands. It was heavy, probably 15 pounds of rusted iron. He walked through the forest as the sun rose, following paths he knew by heart, until he reached the edge of Clayton Vance's property. Vance's farm sat at the boundary between civilization and wilderness, a sprawling collection of fields and outbuildings that had been in his family for 3 generations. Vance himself was known throughout the county as a hard man, quick to anger and slow to forgive. He posted his land aggressively, prosecuted trespassers without mercy, and made no secret of his contempt for government regulations, especially those concerning wildlife. Elias approached the fence line as the sun cleared the horizon. He hung the trap on the fence post, securing it with the broken hemp rope from his pocket. He tied it using a ranger's hitch, an ancient knot that had been taught to the first generation of forest rangers, back when the position still meant something. The knot was distinctive, complex, beautiful in its symmetry. Anyone who knew anything about the old ways would recognize it immediately. Beside the trap, he placed a jar of wild honey. Not just any honey, but the dark, almost black honey that came from bees who fed on the mountain laurel that bloomed in the highest elevations. This honey was rare, difficult to harvest, valuable. And next to the honey, he placed a single bullet, a rifle round, 30-06 Springfield, corroded green with age. He had found this bullet 10 years ago, lodged in a tree near his cabin, found it along with fresh deer blood and drag marks leading onto Vance's property, poaching, during closed season, on public land. Elias stepped back and looked at his work. 3 objects. The trap, marked with Vance's own name. The honey, proof of access to places Vance could never reach. The bullet, evidence of crime. Together, they formed a message that required no words. He turned and walked back toward his cabin, following the fence line until it curved away into the trees. He did not look back. Clayton Vance stepped out of his house 2 hours later, coffee mug in hand, ready to begin another day. He started toward his barn but stopped when he saw something hanging on the fence. His first instinct was anger. Someone had been on his property. Someone had touched his fence. He strode toward it, ready to curse, ready to tear down whatever prank some fool kid had pulled. Then he saw the knot. His face went white. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A conversation from 30 years ago. If you ever see this knot, his father had said, it means death stopped, I but decided to spare your life. It means someone who could have killed you chose not to. It means you owe them everything. Vance's hand shook as he reached for the trap. He saw his own name stamped in the iron, saw the honey, which should have been impossible to obtain, saw the bullet, and recognized it, remembered the deer he had shot that day a decade ago, remembered dragging it off public land under cover of darkness. His hunting dogs, 3 Dobermans that he had trained to be vicious and aggressive, lay flat on the ground near the fence. They were whining, making sounds he had never heard them make before. They would not approach the fence. They stared toward the forest with their ears back, trembling. Vance's eyes followed their gaze, across his fields, across the boundary markers, to the distant shape of a small wooden cabin barely visible through the trees, the silent bird's nest. He had heard stories about the old man who lived there, the deaf ranger who had supposedly done things during his career that defied belief. But Vance had always dismissed them as exactly that. Stories, legends, the kind of nonsense old-timers told each other over drinks. He picked up the jar of honey with shaking hands. The message was clear. Your fences mean nothing. Your guns mean nothing. Your dogs mean nothing. I walked onto your property in the middle of the night and left you a gift instead of what you deserved. This is your only warning. Vance turned and ran, actually ran, to the barn behind his house. He dragged out every iron trap he owned, 8 of them in total, some inherited from his father and grandfather. He threw them into his scrap metal pile and locked the gate with a padlock. Then he stood there, breathing hard, occasionally glancing toward the forest with the expression of a man who had just realized how close he had come to something terrible. Late that afternoon, Elias returned to his normal routine. He sat on his porch, weaving a new basket from thin strips of bamboo. The wind chime hung silent above him, its rope still broken, dangling loose. Echo slept in his lap, purring steadily. In the shed, Jasper rested, his wounded leg healing slowly but surely. Elias did not repair the wind chime rope. He found that he did not miss it. The rope had connected him to one kind of world, a world of human sounds and human warnings. But it had also separated him from something else, something he was only beginning to understand. The seasons turned, autumn gave way to winter, snow fell heavy on Blackwood Ridge, covering everything in white silence. Jasper healed and grew strong. In early December, on a clear morning when the temperature rose just enough to melt the top layer of snow, Sierra appeared at the edge of the forest. She came to the cabin and sat on the porch, waiting. Elias opened the shed door. Jasper limped out, his legs still stiff but functional. He looked at Elias for a long moment, then followed his mother back into the trees. Winter deepened. Elias saw tracks sometimes, circling his cabin in the snow, bobcat tracks, multiple sets. They never came close enough to trigger the broken wind chime, but they were there, watching, checking. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, melting the snow in patches and bringing the first green shoots up through the dead leaves. The forest came alive again with sound, though Elias could experience it only through vibration. Birds returned to nest. Small animals emerged from hibernation. Life reasserted itself. On a warm afternoon in late April, Elias sat on his porch, repairing a leather harness. He felt vibration through the floorboards and looked up. Sierra stood at the edge of the clearing, but she was not alone. 2 tiny bobcat kittens stumbled around her feet, their legs still unsteady, their spots bright against pale fur. Sierra moved forward slowly, the kittens following. She led them directly to the porch steps and stopped, maintaining a respectful distance of about 10 feet. Then she did something remarkable. She nudged each kitten forward gently with her nose, positioning them side by side in front of her. It looked for all the world like a presentation, a formal introduction. Elias understood immediately. He sat perfectly still, not moving, not reaching out. He knew that if he touched the kittens, if he left his scent on their fur, Sierra might reject them. This was not about contact. This was about acknowledgement. She was showing him her children, showing him that life continued, that the cycle was unbroken. The kittens stared at him with wide golden eyes, curious but cautious. One of them took a tentative step forward. Sierra made a soft sound, too quiet for Elias to hear, but evidently clear to the kitten, who immediately stepped back into position. They stood there for 15 minutes, cat family and old man, connected by invisible threads of trust and mutual respect. Finally, Sierra made another soft call. She turned, and the kittens turned with her, following their mother back toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, she stopped and looked back. Elias raised his hand slowly, waving goodbye. She watched him for another moment, then disappeared into the undergrowth, her children bouncing along behind her. Elias lowered his hand and sat back in his chair. Echo jumped up into his lap, settling down with his paws tucked under his chest. The broken wind chime rope swayed slightly in the breeze overhead, its severed ends dangling free. He had not reconnected it. He realized now that he never would. That rope had been his link to the human world, the world of sound and warning and fear. But when it broke, it had freed him to hear something else entirely, to hear with his heart instead of his ears, to understand that communication happened in ways that transcended the physical, that trust could be built across species, across the boundaries that humans drew between civilization and wilderness. In the fading light of afternoon, Elias watched the shadows lengthen across his clearing. Somewhere in the forest, Sierra was teaching her kittens to hunt, to survive, to thrive. Jasper was running again on his healed leg. Willow was growing into her full strength. The forest was alive and whole, and he had played a small part in keeping it that way. The greatest legacy we leave behind, Elias thought, is not what we possess, not the land we own, or the things we accumulate. The greatest legacy is the living seeds we protect, the lives we preserve so they can rise freely and continue the endless cycle. We are not separate from the forest. We are part of it, woven into the same fabric, bound by the same threads of dependence and care. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Echo purred in his lap. The broken rope swayed overhead, and Elias smiled, content in his silence, knowing that he had heard the truest sound in the world, the sound of life continuing, the sound of trust given and returned, the sound of the forest speaking to those willing to listen, not with ears, but with something deeper. In the gathering dusk, the silhouettes of the bobcat family faded into the mist rising from the hollow. They left behind no physical trace, no mark that could be measured or documented, but they left something far more valuable. They left proof that wildness and wisdom could coexist, that humans and animals could meet as equals when fear was abandoned, that the invisible bonds between all living things were stronger than any rope or chain or fence. Elias sat on his porch until full darkness fell, until the stars emerged overhead like scattered diamonds, until the temperature dropped and sent him finally inside. He closed the door but did not latch it. Echo settled onto the bed, his one eye already closing in sleep. The hurricane lantern flickered low, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Tomorrow would bring new work, new tasks, the endless maintenance that came with living alone in the wilderness. But tonight, Elias simply rested, his hand over the pocket where the broken rope still nestled against his heart. That rope had snapped at exactly the right moment, freeing him from one kind of safety to embrace another kind entirely. The kind that came from trust, the kind that came from action, the kind that came from recognizing that we are all connected, human and animal, predator and prey, young and old, in a web of relationships that transcended understanding but demanded respect. He closed his eyes and felt the vibrations of the cabin settling around him, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the steady rhythm of Echo's breathing. And underneath it all, if he focused carefully, he could feel the pulse of the forest itself, the slow heartbeat of the mountains, the ancient rhythm that had been here long before him and would continue long after. This was his legacy, not the cabin or the land or the stories people might tell. His legacy was measured in the lives he had touched, the creatures he had saved, the balance he had maintained. Sierra and her kittens, running free under the stars. Jasper, healed and strong. Willow, growing into her inheritance. And countless others he would never know about, rippling outward from his choices like rings on water. The silent bird's nest stood quiet in the darkness, its wind chime broken, its rope severed, But Elias had learned that silence was not the absence of sound. Silence was its own kind of music, its own language. If you knew how to listen, and he had learned to listen with everything he had. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.